Welcome everybody to this webinar from the Christian Science Monitor with Taylor Luck, our Middle East correspondent. I will introduce him in a minute, but I wanted first to say thank you very much for joining us. It's really wonderful to have a few hundred of you actually here with us today to hear what Taylor thinks about in his work and what he thinks about the news in the region. And we really appreciate your support and interest. Before I introduce Taylor a little more in detail, I wanted to also introduce you to Dave Scott, who's our audience engagement editor, and he's going to share a little bit about how you can send in questions and comments via Zoom, which we'll get to a little bit later in the hour. So Dave, do you want to explain a little bit?
Hi, everybody. Yes, I'll be monitoring your questions and comments and then passing them along to Taylor and Amelia as they come in via the Zoom question and answer function. So to ask a question or to offer a comment, simply click on that little Q&A button in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screens. All right, just type in your questions and we'll pass them along to Taylor and Amelia. So thank you. I'll be back in a few minutes.
I'll see you in a bit. So now Taylor Luck. Taylor, as I mentioned, is obviously our Middle East correspondent. He's been with the Monitor for about 5 years, and we think he brings a really special lens to what he does. But I thought he could introduce himself a little bit by telling us, Taylor, how you landed in the Middle East, how you ended up there, and how you learned to speak such good Arabic.
Well, first of all, again, I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day. I wish we could do this in person, but hopefully, you know, in the months ahead we can. And welcome to a Zoom window into my home. You know, obviously in this part of the region, especially in the Levant and the Gulf, you know, you're supposed to greet guests at your home, traditionally with a cup of coffee. So I know you can't be with me today, but at least ceremoniously, I would like to offer you a cup of coffee as we sit here today. And while I drink one. So I guess this is our communal cup as we get started. So for me, I mean, I learned Arabic basically under pressure, to be honest. I mean, when I went to university in the early 2000s, there weren't many Arabic programs in America. You know, it wasn't really seen as a strategic language or one of that much importance before 9/11. So, you know, when I was studying at Beloit College, you know, in Wisconsin, my only chance to learn Arabic was with Arab students. So they were nice enough to sit with me, students from Jordan, from Egypt, from Bahrain, and they taught me the basics, you know, letters, sounds, basic grammar, words. And by the time I graduated, I wanted to come back to the region just so I can work on my language more, maybe, you know, find a career in the region. And so when I was looking at a way to learn Arabic, the only job I could find was in journalism as an editor of the English newspaper in Jordan, the Jordan Times. And so I came in as an editor and I was the only non-Jordanian. So I was, you know, working and living and breaking bread with middle class and working class Jordanians, you know, in this, you know, edition building that was sagging over the printing press of the main Arabic newspaper. But through that, I mean, it was just a chance to not, you know, experience the region looking at it from above, but living on the ground with my colleagues and with my friends. And so, you know, when you're on, you know, a deadline to basically go out there and speak all in Arabic and take these stories back and have it published the next day with your name on it, you know, your mistakes are very public. But I think that process, though, through really focusing, you know, on people's stories, on, you know, the expressions behind the words, the meaning that it carries, you know, I kind of developed this mission really to take people's words and carry it with me and bring it out to the world. And so for me, that is, you know, kind of became, you know, not just a career, but became sort of a duty.
And Taylor, carrying those words out to the world really, to me, speaks to the kind of journalism that you excel in, which is sharing the world's common humanity and helping us all understand each other better. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that kind of a lens, how you bring that to your work. And of course, this meeting today is about finding signs of progress as well. And I think that informs how you look at your region as well.
Well, I think progress and humanity go hand in hand. And I think what really speaks to, a monitor journalism is how it's received by the people we interview. I've written for many, American and English publications over the last 14 years. But there's something that much more special with the monitor. And I hear the same thing every time that I interview someone, and it's the same sentence. They say, "Why are you interested in us? Why would an American newspaper want to hear what we say? Why would an American newspaper want to know, the plight of Black Tunisians facing racism? Why would an American newspaper be interested in Bedouin concepts of conflict resolution?" And the fact is that they are so stunned. A lot of the time when I get every single day, they say, "Well, I thought you Americans only cared about wars and terrorism." And I think the fact that, what we're doing at the Monitor and what I explain to people is that, we're exploring shared experiences and shared humanity. We express it in different ways. Maybe it's in different tones and in different shades, but it's still the same common challenges, the common triumphs, the common experiences. And we enrich ourselves by learning more about others. We learn more about ourselves. And so I think, what it says is, for a lot of these people I speak to that are always at first very puzzled, and once they get what we're doing, they really latch onto it, because I think we're not just challenging people's views of what, the Middle East is for our readers, but we're really challenging the views of people here in the region in terms of what American values are, but what American journalism can be. That's not just a top-down relationship where we're just looking from above and taking a quote and taking a photo, but we're actually having a equal relationship between interviewee, reporter, and readers back home, where we're all just companions on a shared journey into common humanity and also exploring our common challenges. So really, it's a sense of teamwork. And I think you can't explore progress until you first put everyone at a level playing field. And that's what the Monitor does so well.
Yeah, I love that sense of relationship. And I think when you look at things that way, it's reflected in your journalism. It makes a huge difference in terms of giving people a sense of being on the ground and being there with you. And speaking of that, I might be just, before we jump into questions that some of you sent in before the webinar, could you just share some of the datelines that you've reported from? Taylor travels quite a bit, and he was traveling right up until I think January of this year, and then obviously things stopped. But just give a sense of where you've been around the region.
Yes. I mean, so in terms of datelines, of course, we have obviously Riyadh, Amman, Abu Dhabi, Cairo, Tunis, Carthage in particular. Also way in southwest Tunisia, on the Tunisian-Algerian border, Kasserine, Oman, Muscat, and dozens and dozens of places in between. What I really like is when we get all those bylines that are not capital cities. And if you go look back, we have lots of those.
That's great. Well, thank you. As I mentioned, we have a number of questions that we thought we'd start off with before we jump into your questions. And one of the first ones was, what is your general sense of what the Arab Spring accomplished?
Well, I think a lot of people think the Arab Spring failed. I mean, because out of all these countries, only one democracy popped up in Tunisia. But the fact is, it didn't fail. And it was only the first wave of a long process that I think might carry out decades. What we're seeing right now is, Arab citizens across the world are committed to nonviolent protest movements, activism, journalism to push for their rights. And it's not just about forming a democracy. I think it's about a people who have been systematically robbed of the right of self-determination for a century, only moving towards what is natural, which is the right to determine their futures. I mean, I think, and one of the reasons why that despite the big backlash we're seeing from all these regimes, this progress is keep on moving, because every single aspect of life is affected when you cannot determine what goes on in your community, what goes on in your country. You can't even decide, the state of your schools in your neighborhood or whether they have a post office or not. You can't even decide up on top what your foreign policy is. It's all connected. And in terms of progress, even in countries where there's backlashes, we're seeing younger activists going out again and again, pushing for change. I remember I was in Egypt just in December and doing a report for our recent Navigating Uncertainty series. And I was interviewing the journalists at Al Mada Masr, which is the last independent media outlet in all of Egypt, the region's biggest country. And so when I went in there, it's a bunch of young people in their 20s and the oldest person maybe in their early 30s. And I expected many of them had become journalists because of the Arab Spring, because of protests for democracy and change. But many of them had only become journalists a couple of years ago. And so I asked the managing editor, and I asked, well, why did you, get into the field? So I started in 2015. And of course, that was after the big crackdowns in Sisi's Egypt, which is the biggest or second largest jailer of journalists currently. And I said, well, wasn't that a bit a little late? And he said, well, no. He said, one message we got from the Arab Spring is we need activism. We need people in the streets, but we need journalists. We need witnesses. We need to have testimony of where we are in this point in time. Otherwise, we're going to be lost as a people. And so I think a lot of people are taking those lessons. I mean, even today, right now, there's been, obviously protest movements in Algeria, which are still going on. Sudan has gone through a transition. Even today, as I speak, there's protests in Jordan who are protesting against the dissolution of a teachers union. They found that just the fact that the government banned the teachers union was such a big affront to their civil society and to their civil liberties. People are out in the streets en masse despite martial law. So I think that we're going to see this go on for decades, and I don't see it as a defeat. I see it as just, an arc.
Great. Well, here's a question about the U.S. in the Middle East. It relates to America's increasing disengagement from the region. What do you see as both the positive and or the negative impact of that?
Well, obviously, there's positive and negatives to it. And I think the immediate positive, this disengagement, which started really in Obama's second term, is the fact that countries realize they have to, fend for themselves, be more self-sustainable, and work out their issues or conflicts with each other in a more constructive way without America fighting their battles for them. Unfortunately, this came at a time, and this U.S. disengagement came at a time the whole international order has been weakened. The whole system of international institutions have been weakened. There's no other global leadership right now. So I think a lot of people have the feeling that that there is no sense of security. There's no one out there to sort out fair play in the world. So it's increased insecurity, and it's increased a lot of countries basically lashing out and competing. So rather than decreasing conflict and tensions, it's increased because nothing has stepped in to provide that sense of security or order. It kind of reminds me, or remembers back 2015 when the Iran nuclear deal was announced. And that was a big step towards US disengagement, with the idea that we no longer have a security issue with Iran. And as Obama later said in one of his interviews, that he thought that the Saudis and Iranians should sort their issues out and share the region. So I watched the press conference of the nuclear deal from Riyadh, reporting for a cover story for the Monitor. And I was sitting in basically what's called basically a diwan, a long room with cushions around it, and just people watching TV. So there were people that were former military, there were officials, there were a big group of journalists. And as they were watching this, they said, okay, this is a sign that we're on our own. And now it's a test of who's with us and who's against us. And within 2 days, they amplified their war in Yemen and made a full-scale war. So we see that, the role of the U.S. is very positive. And even if we're not engaged militarily, there's a way to be engaged to provide leadership. So unfortunately, we've had some positives, but we've seen the increased conflict, which has increased across North Africa and the Middle East.
Well, let me ask you one more question before, and then just to let everybody know, Taylor is also a very good photographer, and we thought we'd show you some of his photographs and have him speak to their significance a little bit. But before we do that, one person commented that it's kind of baffling to them how Western media still report favorably about certain countries in the Gulf region, while Iran is cast in a very negative light. What's your position on, or what are your views on this as a Monitor correspondent?
Well, I think my views and the way I go about it, and I think it's in harmony with the Monitor approaches. We don't boycott a community or society or people because we don't agree with their government or the government's actions, or maybe their governments don't share our values. And I think we look very critically at governments and their motivations and their policies. I think unfortunately there are certain Western journalists that go to Gulf countries and they're kind of wowed by the horse and pony shows and kind of don't really delve into the motivations behind it. And I think whereas we do a very good job, we have our stories about people and about societies. But when we talk about the governments, we look at their motivations. We look at what they're doing and we don't shy away. I know in our recent cover story on the kind of cultural opening in Saudi Arabia, we basically had a whole page disclaimer, saying that this is, Mohammed bin Salman is opening up, social reforms, social freedoms at a time he's denying, political freedoms. In terms of Iran, I think that the issue is here why some countries get more coverage than others, especially in the West. It also has to do with access. The Gulf countries, they see, value in having good public relations by having, wowing people with concerts and bringing in foreign journalists. Whereas Iran feels that, I think largely, certain elements definitely feel that, the West is biased against it anyway, so there's no really reason to even try. But, in terms of, what our correspondent Scott Peterson does in Iran is quite frankly amazing. And I'll bet the shirt off my back is the best English language coverage we have from Iran, because you hear from the people, you hear from the stories, and it's not in that very narrow American lens. And that's very rare. And I think it's so important that we have that, because if we don't have that, we're dehumanizing entire people. And so I think that the Monitor is the place where we get that balance right. And unfortunately, I think in other realms, you don't. I think it's correct. I think you're going to more likely see a more favorable light of the Gulf than you ever are in Iran, because people don't work that hard to get the access that we are day in and day out.
Well, one thing, as you've mentioned, that one thing that humanizes your subjects is, excuse me, good writing and good reporting, but also images do a lot to help us understand where you're landed. And I thought maybe you could share with our listeners some of these photos and what their significance is.
Yeah, this first one is an art installation by Emirati artist that's currently in the Ithra Art and Arts Museum in Eastern Saudi Arabia. The title of the piece is "I Forgive You, You Are Forgiven." And it's basically two photos next to each other. And it's one of a wife kissing her husband on the head and vice versa, showing basically forgiveness, which is also a core Islamic tenet known as tasammuh. And what makes this interesting, especially in my view, is that in Saudi Arabia for the last 20 or 30 years, as its hardline clerics had control over society, public displays of affection were basically forbidden. Even amongst, married couples, it wouldn't happen. They wouldn't even hold hands in public. If they did, it'd be very rarely. So to have this public display of affection at the centerpiece of a museum, in Saudi Arabia's first museum, I think it goes to show, that of a society kind of gravitating back towards, a more openness that is in harmony with faith and culture, which I think is pretty interesting. And it stood out to me.
Yeah, it's beautiful. The next photo we were going to look at is called Wadi Rum Rock Art. Tell us a little bit about this and where it is.
Yeah, so this photo we did for a story last November, and it's in Wadi Rum in southern Jordan. And so for those of you who know, that's where David Lean shot Lawrence of Arabia. And this is actually where, the Great Arab Revolt did take place in southern Jordan. And this rock art is basically it's inscriptions and its drawings left behind by Bedouins from about 3,000 years ago. They're basically Arab descendants, but they had a different language. They had a slightly different identity, but they are the forefathers of the current Bedouin in Wadi Rum. And, but for most of the community, they had no idea. They had no idea what these symbols meant. So you had Bedouins that would use the rocks to, make a fire, to have tea. People would, accidentally break them, graffiti. So USAID and the American Center for Oriental Research and archaeologists did a project where they developed an app for the phone, and they brought in a Jordanian archaeologist, and he taught the Bedouin in the area the significance of these inscriptions, and he taught them how to read them. And they gave them an app so they can go out, when they see a rock, they can go take a photo of it, put the GPS location, interpret what it says, put in the state of preservation of the rock or potential threats. And so people, the community started safeguarding it because they realized this is part of their identity. They realized these people 3,000 years ago had the same name, had the same cultural practices. So they got a sense of ownership of these. And so what I really like about this is that it's, in this image, you're seeing basically the technology of the 21st century, not severing people from their past, but rebonding people with their past identity, which I think is rare, and I think it's pretty neat.
Yeah, and prompting a really important shift in thought a little bit in terms of how they view these. It's
Exactly.
fascinating. Just one more photo we'll show you is a photo of a mural in the Jordanian town of Karak. And you can talk about the very different faith images that you're seeing there.
Yeah, I mean, right here, obviously, we have, two neighbors, basically, in the town of Karak. And the right is Izdaham, left, sorry, Izdaham Saoub. And obviously she is Muslim. And on the right is Father Balus Bekain, and he is, Christian. And basically this photo was taken weeks after ISIS staged an attack on the town of Karak in Jordan. And in Karak, in southern Jordan, basically Christians and Muslims have lived side by side since the 6th century, early 7th century. And kind of what makes this, significance is that this community has stayed together. And it's not just about people being neighbors living side by side, but, as it's mostly a pastoral Bedouin community, they would camp together. When they built their first homes, they built their homes next to each other and had a courtyard where they would meet for meals each day. And so, I was struck that, right after this attack happened in the town, this woman, Izdaham, she painted this mural on the outer wall right by the church as a sign to their Christian neighbors that saying that this is still also a Christian town and that you are still welcomed here. This is our town. No one's going to take away the Christian identity, the Muslim identity, and these interfaith relations we have. This is our town, as a sign of, goodwill gesture. And I just think that's, to me, I always, knew that there is, a lot of interfaith coexistence in Jordan, but the fact that it goes so deep, to the fact that, mothers of different faiths take babies of their neighbors who work and nurse them, and people consider themselves brothers and sisters through nursing, even though they're of different faiths. Or the fact that, young Muslim men, they ask the priest to ask their fiancés hand in marriage from the family. So the fact that this tight bond is still there, I really appreciate that, because I think it is in stark contrast to how we depict faith in the West sometimes, where Christianity and Islam is almost depicted as two conflicting civilizations or cultures that are clashing, whereas they are part of the same Abrahamic family. And many places like here in Karak, they still are one family.
Thanks. Those are amazing images, and they really do speak to the kind of work that you do. I think that just shows us much greater richness than we typically get out of the Middle East in reporting, and that's really hopeful. I thought at this point we might move to some of your questions in the audience, so I'll hand it off to Dave. Dave, can you, before you tell us what you've got, can you remind everybody how to share their questions?
Yeah, like I said earlier, just if you have a question while Taylor's talking, go ahead and click on the Q&A button, which is right at the bottom of the screen, and type in your questions. And many of you already sent a bunch in, so we'll get to those in just a second here. And I just a point of clarification too. You sent in many questions to us before the event, and we've started to chip away at those in the first part. These questions that Taylor were asking actually all came from you guys. So Taylor, the top of mind for a number of the people who are listening is the explosion in Beirut that happened yesterday in the port of Beirut. And they're curious about your sense of what's happening there. Let me just read one of them. There's several here, but one of it is, how will the Lebanese move forward following yesterday's horrific blast in Beirut? I'm hearing reports that Lebanon is on the edge of financial collapse. Can this country survive? What's your sense of that? I
think the country can and will survive. It's going to be a long, difficult road back to stability. Because I mean, we look to the blast that happened, uh, and we look to the economic crisis, and we look to all the other crises Lebanon has been through. It has all been through, due to mainly corruption, political corruption, and mismanagement. And although there isn't, say maybe a dictator that sits on top of Lebanon, it's the fact that regional powers have been supporting this kind of, cobbled together political elite on top, that progress has not been made in so many areas. I mean, even I know the Western diplomats are very frustrated with the government and their inability to reform. And so I think that there is, there is a ray of hope that this horrible accident and its direct ties to corruption and mismanagement will, shake up the political elite to the point where that they will enact the needed reforms to allow economic reforms and allow greater transparency. And I think one of the slivers of shining light in this is we're seeing a lot of regional outpour of support. I mean, we have, Saudi Arabia, we have the UAE, Iran, Jordan, Tunisia, and they're all sending support, medical support, food aid. And so hopefully this will be, a chance that both the rotten, if you excuse my language, the rotten political elite lessen their control, and we see more of a regional outpour of support to assist Lebanon away from their ideological political differences. And I think that there is an opportunity. I think it will happen, but it will take a few years.
Mm-hmm. And we have a follow-up question too on the Saudi. You were in Saudi recently, and there's a question here. I fear for the women human rights workers in Saudi. What is the hope or means for them to be released from prison and allowed to be free?
I think the fact that we still have the voices of the women activists being repeated in the Western media, and their stories being told over and over again, and their updates being told on social media, that is the greatest hope for their release. I think that is the greatest leverage that they have. I think one of the reasons why it has not translated to their release is, fortunately, unfortunately, the lack of the American voice to really add to that. And I think, we've seen discussions in the British House of Commons. We haven't seen it from really strong statements from Britain even. So I think that, that is keeping their plight alive. But I think that we need more voices from Western governments to say that this is a priority for us. And if you really, if you really cherish our relationship, this should be a priority.
That's one thing actually that you've written about before, that even with that the United States, even with all its warts and all, everybody, it's a complicated country and many complicated relationships, but its voice in human rights really still matters a lot. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that in terms of, because it would be logical to think, for example, well, nobody's going to listen to the United States right now. They don't seem that interested. And yet when the US does weigh in, it makes a difference.
Yeah, I can think of two quick examples that recently, I mean, when Madame Masr, the Egyptian news organization, they were stormed in November, and the chief editor and two other editors were taken in a squad car, going to be sent to jail. And of course, in Egypt, going to jail means being disappeared. It means you might not ever get out because they have bended the rules to allow indefinite detention. And no journalist had gotten out of jail, basically, at that period. So everyone was concerned about them. And so, of course, Western diplomats who read and know them, they were messaging, they were kind of, rebuking Egypt. But when the US rebuked, basically that helped lead to the release. And 2 days later, the US even made a very public statement in support of Madame Masr and against their detention. And so that shows how even just words can really do make a change. And so far, they're still operating. I mean, having that voice has helped support that little space for them to operate. Also, real briefly, in Sudan, America, basically there was atrocities being committed by certain commandos that were being indirectly supported by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Well, the US went out and spoke against that. And that ended up leading to these foreign powers basically, stepping back a bit and allowing for a type of reconciliation to take place. So we, even though with our warts and all, and even with a lot of work to do at home, our words carry weight.
Taylor, we have a number of questions here from people who are interested in how you do your job and interested in your relationship with the monitor. But there's one, and we may hit a few of those, but I'd like to just start with one from someone whose name is Meg. She says she's 14 and interested in working as a foreign correspondent. What are the best steps that I can take to be an effective journalist, witness to reporting events?
Well, first of all, Meg, thank you so much for your question. I think the most important thing is, to be interested in a specific region, and to learn the language, because that allows you to move around, and that allows you to hear people's stories, from their own mouths rather than through an interpreter. So I would say if you're interested in a region, it could be Latin America, it could be Africa, it could be one country, it could be, Europe, but, get interested in a certain area and learn the language or multiple languages. And from there, your curiosity will be your engine and will drive you all the way to your career. And I think that's the most important step that you can take.
Good. And looking at your relationship with the monitor, you worked in the Middle East for 14 years. You worked for different news organizations, including the Jordanian one you mentioned earlier. How has working for the Christian Science Monitor informed or changed your approach to journalism?
I'd say it's changed my approach to journalism because it has allowed me to explore more of looking from other people's points of views. I think even though when I've tried to, write different types of stories, for other publications, I won't name names, it'll never make it even to the slush pile. They want to know what's the latest news, something that has to do with America's interests. But the Monitor really freed me to write about societies and people and how they are and what they work for and their trials and their tribulations and their triumphs. And it freed me up to kind of explore more of how other people see the world. So I think actually the Monitor kind of liberated me from the very narrow American lens and allowed me to explore further in terms of, examine the way people think and how that affects the news in the world.
Good. I have one more question relating to your work as a journalist. How do you work in what most people consider a fairly dangerous region? How do you stay safe? What steps do you have to take when you're out reporting to stay safe?
Well, thankfully, where I'm based in Jordan is very safe. It's, it's one of the few places I've been in the world where you see 3-year-olds walk at 3 a.m. in the morning by themselves. For me, my precautions, I think, is that I'm always in contact with people in the communities that I go to. I don't just show up. So I'm always in constant contact with people from the community, let people know ahead of time, look, I'm coming, this is what I want to do. If you guys have any suggestions, if there's any sensitivities. In advance, I'm always in contact with people on the ground. And so that way it's not really just this kind of sudden, Western strangers walking around taking photos. And I feel like that clears up the majority of misunderstandings. And I think that is maybe the most important really step, I think, for security. And I guess the other part is that, maintaining relationships with states in this region, it's kind of diplomacy, I never censor myself. It never impacts my work, but behind the scenes, constant, showing your face and getting permits and getting access is a lot of work. But also it, means that at the state level, they know who you are, and at the community level, people know who you are. And that, I think, is the best really defense you can take.
Have you ever felt like in a dangerous situation?
Well, not directly, but there are moments where you say, oh, that's not comfortable. Like once I went down to Kasserine, which is southwestern Tunisia on the Algerian border. And that's in the mountains where ISIS was based at that time and Al-Qaeda was based. And so I was sitting there in coffee and I do an interview, and there was a little noise off in the hills, and the guy points and says, "See that? Yeah, that's ISIS. See that? Yeah, that's Al-Qaeda." And he's just sitting back, sipping his cappuccino. He's just nonchalant about the whole business. And I was like, you know what? That's not very comfortable. And I asked him, well, what do how's the security presence? He's like, oh, they run away. They come down and take their food every other week, and they go back up in the mountains. It's okay. So, so there are those moments where just things, when people are nonchalant about things that, are a little bit edgy or dangerous, that's when you stop and go, okay, this is a little uncomfortable.
What are we hearing in the background?
Right now, this is the evening call to prayer. This is the Maghrib call to prayer. So this is the sunset call. That's the fourth prayer of the day. So my neighborhood mosque is about 5 feet away. So I'm sorry if that impedes on the audio, but it is a nice way to end the evening.
Yeah, it adds an aura of authenticity to you're definitely in Jordan. I have a question here from someone who's asking about reforms and changes to the education system. Somebody who says, I'm so dismayed at the rote system of education that kids are getting in the region, which does not spur creative or critical thinking. Is there anywhere where you're seeing educational reform or progress?
Well, I mean, there has been some attempts. I know Jordan has recently updated its syllabus for schools. I believe Lebanon has as well, and I think we've seen an infusion of some type of minor reforms due to the high presence of Syrian refugees. So we have all these NGOs coming in and doing all these educational programs, and that has had influence on the educational syllabus in Jordan and Lebanon, which host refugees. But I think the reader is alluding to is that there's still very much a top-down approach to teaching, a lot of memorization. So I mean, you're not going to find a liberal arts college, for example. You're not going to find that much participation studies, but there are little initiatives here and there. There's the Hussein Technical University in Jordan, and they're trying to give almost like a liberal arts education to engineers so that they can be more employable and to have English and have more well-rounded knowledge. But I think at the basic level, I think it does. I think reforms are still being very steadily being phased in, and it's been slow.
Quick follow-up. Someone was asking, does it seem odd that 3-year-olds are walking on the streets at 3 a.m. in Jordan?
Well, not if they're hungry. Because they walk to the corner store to pick up chips or soda, and because everyone knows them in the neighborhood, and everyone knows the person at the corner grocery store, and everyone so it's everyone has their eye on the kid as they walk in to grab their chips and walk back. So it's kind of it's a very community approach to neighborhood watch.
Okay.
So it sounds like there's a lot more going on in your neighborhood at 3 a.m. than there is in the typical American community and at 3 a.m. Is that a fair statement?
I think there's more going on at 3 a.m. than there is going on in many American communities at 9:30 p.m., to be quite honest.
Is that due to the heat in part, or is it just kind of just a more vibrant culture?
I think it's more vibrant night culture. Although for Amman, it's grown. It didn't used to be like this 10 or 12 years ago, but it's increased. And I think it's very much, it's Cairo is that type of atmosphere. Cairo and Baghdad, that type of nightlife. And then that's culture I think has been exported across the Arab world, where it's just, well, let's go out to a cafe, let's see people be seen, and, drink coffee and laugh the night away. And I think this night, pastime has become a regional culture.
Again, we've got many questions here, so I'm going to try to hit as many as we can. Are today's young Muslims less religious? In other words, is Islam declining among youth in the same way that Christianity might be declining in the United States?
I think it's very difficult to compare because it's, what are we determining religiosity? I mean, for example, someone could be, still be a believer in Islam and still believe in certain core tenets, but not pray in mosque. They could just be praying from home. Or maybe they don't pray, but they still believe in God and they still fast, for example, for Ramadan. So it's such a wide spectrum. I know that the Arab Barometer did a study where they intimated that there's less religiosity among certain Arab youth, but it's very difficult to quantify. In terms of my personal views, from the way I see it, I think that it's not less religiosity. I think that there's more broader definitions of what it is to be a good Muslim. And I think people with the internet, with social media, with more speech freedoms, they feel more comfortable to explore those avenues, to say, okay, I'm a big firm believer in my faith, but I have different types of views that might be considered liberal, for example. So I think that rather than religiosity decreasing, I think the definition of being a Muslim perhaps has increased. And in that way that it's made, I think, a lot more people more flexible and maybe more comfortable with their faith.
We have a few questions here about COVID-19. And one of the questions is, which Middle East countries have done best or worst regarding the response to the COVID-19 crisis, and why? And what might be learned from them? And maybe just talk a little bit about your own experience.
Yeah, well, the first off, I mean, the worst hit is Saudi Arabia. I think their cases over 250,000 or 280,000. And after that, I think it was the UAE. So the Gulf had the hardest time. And one reason for that is the fact that they almost had like a two-class system where they had citizens and Western foreign workers, and then they had Asian foreign workers and day laborers almost like as a separate class. And so for the Indian and Pakistani and the Asian workers, they were staying in dormitories, 15, 20 people to a room. So, I mean, there's no way you can do social distancing. So while people in their apartments in Riyadh were, doing social distancing, wearing masks, you had the people that, that bagged their groceries, that cooked their food, that worked in their companies were spreading it. So they are still very much, battling it, to be quite honest. The best country is the one I'm in right now, is Jordan. And they were very aggressive. They got their first case the same as Saudi Arabia. And I was in Saudi Arabia at that time. So I canceled the rest of my reporting plans, got to Jordan. A couple of days later, Jordan closed everything. It closed, airports, schools, businesses, and they restricted everyone to the house. And we basically lived on a full lockdown for weeks. And then eventually they allowed us to walk to our corner grocery store and go back under certain hours. So it was a very, very tough lockdown, but we reopened in mid-May, and we have had very few local transmissions. We've had maybe just a dozen local transmissions in the last couple of months. We've had 0 deaths, and overall Jordan has had 9 deaths. And I think from that, and I think the clear lesson there is, hit hard, hit early, and you can recover quickly. But now Jordan is faced with the second problem, which is how do you reopen? Now, we're open within Jordan, but we're not open to the world yet. And I think that's the trick that everyone's still trying to figure out.
Taylor, we had another question about sort of a contemporary issue and the search for progress, but this is more linked to what you might call the barriers of ancient grievances. Do you have a country or a community that you see as a good example of overcoming those barriers and maybe forging some sort of community or path to progress related to them?
In terms of, communities come together, in terms of, rather than communities actually, and what I've seen kind of international efforts to gather people together around the table, from countries that normally would be at odds with each other. And the most successful of those forums I've seen are science related. So in Jordan has basically under UNESCO has the Sesame. It's a light synchrotron particle accelerator facility. And on a regular basis, you have Iranians, Israelis, Turks, Egyptians, Jordanians using this technology to do things, anything from improving agriculture, battling climate change, using it for medical tools, using it to look through rocks and through archaeology without damaging the archaeology. And so when I've seen those initiatives, people, I've seen those very successful at bringing people together at those common areas. Jordan has been successful in the past at trying to do joint projects with Israel to save the Dead Sea, which is receding. So they had a joint project to bring sea from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea to save it. Oman is good at linking people from different countries. But I think what is holding back the progress, that natural push for people to come together, is this political environment we are in the world, where basically everyone feels like it's every man and woman for herself. So we saw a window of progress in terms of Israelis and Palestinians working together on battling COVID. Working together in teams. They were doing a joint testing center. They were coordinating. But then with the populist politics of the Israeli government, made it impossible for the Palestinians to continue, and it just fell apart. So I think that one, sliver of hope from this COVID crisis is that there is a huge space for joint cooperation from these countries and communities. And I think it's in everyone's interest to work together. And I think, right now, everyone's very busy addressing their internal issues right now. But I think that we'll see more and more voices of people helping each other out. And I think that's something to monitor in the next few months. I think that will be a point of progress through something that has been very painful for the whole world.
Just as a quick aside, Taylor, was that journey back from Saudi when you had a rather unusual taxi ride?
Yes, so obviously Arab governments work very fast, because they are, they don't really have to deal much of that democracy stuff. So when I was in Saudi, they had their first case around the same time Jordan did. And I was in the Eastern Province reporting, and I found out, talking to people, that the first Corona case was in the Eastern Province. And then I was talking to other people, and I was talking to people who worked for Aramco. They said, yeah, we're shutting down. We're going home. What do you mean you're going home? So yeah, they're going to put everything on lockdown tonight. So what do you mean they're going to put everything on lockdown? They were going to quarantine the entire area. So again, I had to change my plans. So I was going to go take a train back to Riyadh, and I was unable to take it, so I had to take a taxi. And the taxi I took, the driver was the last taxi available out of the Eastern Province. He was about 80. We started our night journey. In about 15 minutes, he pulled over and asked if I would like some tea. And we were on an interstate, with trucks and cars going 100 miles per hour, which is the actual legal speed limit. And I said, okay, okay, let's have tea. Where are we going to have tea? And then he just changed his mind, got out of the driver's side, got to the back, and sat in the back of the car and fell asleep. And I said, what's happening here? He said, oh, can you drive? You can just drive us for a bit. I'm going to take a nap now. I'm tired. So I'm stuck on this highway in eastern Saudi Arabia with literally a Corona quarantine looming. So I got in the driver's seat of this taxi car, and I drove a Saudi Arabian taxi from the Eastern Province all the way to Riyadh. A 4.5-hour journey going 100 miles per hour. I was wearing a suit, had a tie, obviously blue eyes, brown hair. So the best part of the trip, though, was on the right are all the trucks. So as I'm driving by, every single truck driver is looking out the window, seeing who's this kid driving, a Saudi taxi. But I didn't make it to Riyadh in time, and I got to Amman the next day. So I just about beat the lockdown.
I imagine you were pretty happy you had language skills at that moment, right? When you pulled over. Otherwise,
Yeah,
it's a little confusing.
It would have been a very long wait, I think. Yeah. That's another key, everyone at home. Know your language when you're going to do international reporting. It'll help you in ways you'll never imagine.
We got some questions too. Someone was overhearing our earlier conversation about how you met your wife, and they were asking about Syria. Is there any, she says, Penelope asks, my heart bleeds for the people of Syria. What rays of light and hope do you see for them at this point?
I think my hope for the people of Syria is the fact that the foreign powers that have been meddling and really tearing it apart have bigger problems back home. I mean, Saudi Arabia has, a health crisis and economic crisis. Iran can no longer afford its militias and its support of Bashar al-Assad. And I think everyone is trying to find a way to work a transition in that country. So I think that, the fact that the people who have been pushing this conflict are all just exhausted and licking their wounds and trying to rebuild at home opens up space. I just think the difficulty right now is figuring out what that looks like. And it's been a long heartbreak watching Syria the last decade. But I think that the fact that everyone has been exhausted at this point, that there is path for the way forward. There is hope, but just finding what does that look like? What would that transition be? I mean, how do you get Assad out there? Do you rebuild a government, interim government? I think that, again, as I said earlier, that requires some leadership. And we haven't had leadership from the West on that. But if we had diplomatic push, I think everyone would be willing to move to a post-conflict stage.
I have a question here about education and women. In general, in the Muslim world, how progressive is life and education for women? Now, that's a pretty broad question. Maybe you can sort of pick and choose a few of those places that you've reported on and have some sense of how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, because it's a very, we're talking about the Middle East, North Africa, we're talking about two continents and then some. So it's very difficult to make generalizations. But I mean, at least in the Arab world, education and women's education has been, a focus point for many governments, because they've seen that women's education advancement is part of national advancement. So, I mean, if you look at, Tunisia, for example, Algeria, Jordan, Syria, Iraq. I mean, women's education was always, a big deal. Even if there were barriers in the workforce at times, women were expected to go to college and university, and it didn't conflict with religion. I think that the areas where that, women's education has been looked as something that's negative or has been, stunted, have been in communities that have pre-Islamic tribal traditions and patriarchal traditions that are against women's advancement. So we're talking about certain practices in Afghanistan. If we're talking about certain practices in parts of Pakistan, everyone knows Malala's story. So I think that there's a lot of that comes from cultural attitudes that aren't related to religion, whereas Islam puts a heavy emphasis on education for everyone. And so I think what we've seen is in recent years that women's advancement has gone in the Arab world past just education, higher education. It's getting more women in the workforce, getting women in leadership positions. And I think that's been kind of the battle. And to be quite frankly, that's been the battle in America as well. So I think that, in the Arab world, women's education is not the issue. It's breaking the glass ceiling. And I think that glass ceiling covers a large part of the world.
Is there any particular country there that you feel like they've made great progress or significant progress?
Well, we talk about, Lebanon, despite all the crises it's going, I mean, women's education is very high, and they have the highest women participation in parliament, the highest women participation in the economy of the Arab world. And they named the first woman defense minister in the Arab world. And a woman defense minister or secretary of defense is something rare worldwide. Jordan has, really high levels of education for women. I mean, I don't have the exact statistic. It's over 80%, 90% in terms of higher education. But Syria, where a lot of the rural areas weren't having educational services, they weren't sending their daughters to school. So when Syrians were displaced to Jordan and to Lebanon, they can absorb this culture of your daughter has to go to school. Your daughter has to continue. She should be thinking about university. So I've met, girls here, Syrians that came here maybe when they're about 9 or 10, and due to the pressure from their Jordanian women teachers and from their Jordanian neighbors, they pressed their parents to keep them in school and to get them enrolled into university. So what's beautiful is that even despite conflict and displacement, kind of this kind of gift of education is being shared, and it's altering the culture of Syrians.
We have some questions here. I mean, well, obviously the U.S. is very fixated on China. Do you see much Chinese influence in your region? And another question, someone was asking you about are there many people who are studying Mandarin there?
Great question. In terms of people studying Chinese, it's very limited. But in terms of Chinese influence, it's very much increasing, very quietly. So when I was in Tunisia last October, I was surprised to see the amount of Chinese people walking about. I mean, you don't normally see that many people, foreigners really in Tunis. And these Chinese men and women were employees of different companies. And I met a Tunisian translator, and she said that basically, all the work right now is for the Chinese, that they're building up industries, building up investments. It's the same thing in Algeria, same thing in Morocco. And in this part of the region, it's been slower in terms of the Levant. But we are seeing a lot more increased economic cooperation. We've seen China now is the biggest importer of Saudi oil. And there is Chinese Saudi engagement on energy projects, and China's looking to kind of knock the U.S. off as the #1 partner for Saudi Arabia. So it's a many-pronged strategy. But in terms of the people-to-people ground, there's no contact. But where do we see this expressed? I mean, right now, there's hundreds of thousands of Uyghur Muslims in basically what is termed a concentration camp by some people, and not a single Arab government is willing to criticize China, and that shows how close these ties have become.
Mm. Taylor, I'm going to switch over to another topic. I know that you've written about racism has obviously been an important topic, and racial injustice in the U.S. in recent months. Have you seen that issue also rise up as an important topic in your region? And how is that?
Racism, yeah. Racism is something that's not very discussed that much, because I think there's this automatic assumption, we're all Arabs, or we're all Kurds, or we're all of one people, so we don't see color, there's a spectrum, but we don't really see color. There isn't racism. But when actually underneath the table there is. I think the George Floyd protests gave some light on certain communities that have been pushing for equality. And so that's Black Tunisians. There are Black Saudis, for example, as well, that face discrimination. And for these communities, what they've been facing is a lot of them have ties to former slaves who were freed in the region, and they've been in communities that have been disadvantaged ever since. So they don't have access to government services. They don't have access to government jobs or all these perks that everyone else has. And so they've been saying this for a century, that no one respects us, no one gives us a chance, people make fun of us, and no one really ever listened. People say, oh, it's just in jest. No, you're one of us. We accept you. We're not racist. We're not white. But with the George Floyd protests, there were people actually stopping and saying, whoa, let's look at this. And a lot of people on social media were discussing it. There were articles, reports. And I think one thing that brought it out was the ham-fisted responses by social media stars here. So we had Arab social media stars and singers, making themselves in blackface, saying that we support, Black people, we're in solidarity. And the fact that how crass that was made people stop and realize, okay, wait, the way we look at things and think ourselves as not racist, maybe that isn't necessarily true. So it wasn't a big protest movement, but it was a chance for people to stop and kind of do a gut check and say, well, how accepting are we really?
Good. All right, Amelia, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. There was many we didn't get to, but we're running out of time here.
Did you want to share anything about the listing a number of links, or do you want to mention that now at the end?
Yes, there will be, if you stick around after Amelia and Taylor drop off, then there'll be some links to some of the stories in the chat. The little chat box at the bottom, there's a little thought bubble above the chat. If you click on that, you will see a list of some of Taylor's stories, some of the ones he's mentioned here today.
Great. Well, one thing we know about our readers is, the readers of the Monitor, is that they also are great consumers of books. Our book section is really popular, and it just comes through loud and clear what great readers Monitor subscribers are. So we thought it would be helpful if Taylor recommended a couple of books that he thought might be of interest to you all. So Taylor, can you share your suggestions with us?
Yeah, I just have 3 quick suggestions of books, just kind of expanding on the way people in this region kind of view the world, kind of getting different views. So the first one's it's a little academic, but for those of you who like kind of more, academic nonfiction, but something that kind of triggers the brain, is a book called Israelism. And it's by Hassan Barari, who's a Jordanian author and scholar. And basically, it's a riff off of, Edward Said's Orientalism, the whole idea of how, people exoticize and views the region in a certain way from the West. Hassan Barari's book explores the way Arabs view Israel and the scholarly output on Israel, and kind of the dearth or the lack of kind of understanding of Israeli politics, and how that has kind of impacted, regional politics and decisions. So I think that one, it's a little academic, but it's interesting to see how one side sees the other, which you don't see much other. In terms of fiction, I'd like to suggest as an author, Ibrahim al-Koni, who's a Libyan author, and he's had several, books that have been translated into English. But I mean, one in particular I like is Gold Dust, which again, a lot of his stories are about the Tuaregs and the Bedouins in the Libyan desert, but it speaks to kind of universal themes, whether it be ecology or kind of relationship between man and animal, or in terms of justice. And so I think Gold Dust is one, just to hear a kind of contemporary Arab author's voice and kind of the poetry in the words. And then really quick, Ashen, because we're talking about Lebanon recently, for those of you who want to kind of have a more concept of Lebanese society, or in terms of, how life has been in modern Lebanon, this probably goes up to like 2008, but a good kind of on the ground gathering of past and present for Lebanon is the late Anthony Shadid's House of Stone, which is a memoir. And it's about Anthony Shadid's going back to his home village and trying to basically renovate the family home. But it's casual in many areas, but it really captures kind of how interconnected the region has been. And I think that's a great way to start thinking about how really, at the end of the day, a lot of these national borders are meaningless in terms of how people feel attached to one another. So I think that would be my third suggestion.
Those are great suggestions. Thank you. And before I just say a few words of thanks to everybody here, I wanted to mention that we will have a survey that we'll be sending out to all of you. We hope you'll answer just a few simple questions that will be in the email. So please let us know what you thought of this event today, and any other comments you want to share. I'd also like to thank our events team who made today possible. It's led by Promotion and Events Manager Lauren Crandall, producer Greg Fitzgerald, and along with Lena Carlson and Cortland Reekston. The Monitor's product owner is Kim Proctor. And of course, I muted myself at the very beginning of this. I think by now you've probably figured out I'm Amelia Newcomb. I'm the managing editor. Taylor is our Middle East correspondent based in Amman, Jordan. And I just wanted to say before we part ways that, I think as Taylor has brought out, the world doesn't get as much coverage as it should, not only in the United States, but I think in a lot of other Western countries, the Middle East, seen maybe through a particular lens, or every country has its blind spots, but particularly as I look through newsletters that come out of US publications in recent years, the number of world stories they list as must-reads has dwindled. And so I just want to say how thankful we all are that you support global coverage. We can't do it without you. We try to get out to as many places as we can. And our correspondents, my hat's off to them every day for the challenges they persevere through to get you the story, as they say. But we couldn't do it without our readers, and our readers indicating through both subscribing and just reading our stories that they care about the world. It's very affirming for the work that we do. So thank you for that. And thank you, Taylor, so much for taking time today or this evening, where you are, for sharing your work with us. And we hope we'll see you all again soon. So thank you. I'm Amelia and Taylor, and have a good rest of your Wednesday. Taylor, do you want to say?
Thank you again, everyone. Have a great week.